AToy princess. More than 1,000 years ago, in a country on the other side of the world, people grew so polite that they hardly ever spoke to each other, and they never said more than was necessary, like just so, yes indeed, and if you please. It was thought to be the rudest thing in the world for anyone to say they liked or disliked, or loved or hated something, or were happy or miserable. No one ever laughed out loud, and if anyone was seen to cry, then they would have been avoided by their friends. Now the king of this country married a princess from a neighbouring land who was very good and beautiful. But the people in her own home were unlike her husband's people as it was possible to be. They laughed there, and they talked, and were noisy, and they were merry. When they were happy, they smiled, and when they were sad, they cried. In fact, they showed whatever they felt at once, and the princess was just like them. So when she came to a new home, she couldn't understand why there was no shouting and cheering to welcome her, and why everyone was so distant and formal. And after a time, she found they didn't change. They were always the same. They were stiff and quiet. She began to pine. She began to miss her own home. Every day she grew thinner and paler, like a sickness came over her, because she didn't feel like she could express herself like she was used to. And the courtiers were much too polite to comment on or maybe even notice how ill their young queen looked. But she knew it herself, and she believed she was going to die. Now she had a fairy godmother whom she loved dearly, and who was always kind to her. When she knew her end was drawing near, she sent for her godmother, and when she came, they had a long talk alone. Now no one knew what was said, but soon afterwards a little princess was born, and the queen died. Of course the courtiers were sorry that the poor queen had died, but it would have been thought rude to say so. There was a grand funeral, everyone wore black clothes, but everything went on as much as it had been done before. The little baby was called Ursula, and given to some court ladies to raise, to look after. Oh, the poor girl, she cried. She cried since she was a baby, and at first nothing can stop her. And the ladies were frightened. They weren't used to babies crying at all, because that's not what happened in their kingdom. She cried when she was cold. She cried when she was hungry. She made crowing sounds, bubbling sounds when she was pleased. And then eventually, as she grew up, she began to understand, maybe about 2 years old, when her nurses told her in quiet and cold, polite tones that she was being naughty because she laughed or showed pleasure or sadness. The young Ursula grew quieter and more withdrawn. She was a pretty little girl, just like her mum, with a rounded baby face and big, merry blue eyes. But as she grew older, she grew thinner and paler, and her eyes grew less and less merry and bright. She was not allowed to play with any other children because she might learn bad manners, and she was not taught any games or given any toys. So she passed most of her time, when she was not learning her lessons, looking out of the window, sitting on the window seat of her room, watching the birds flying against the sky. And sometimes she would give a sad little sigh when her ladies were not listening, otherwise she'd be told off. She wanted to be like those birds, soaring free. One day the fairy godmother made herself invisible and flew in over the king's palace to see how Ursula was going. She went straight to the nursery, where she found poor little Ursula sitting by the window. It was a very grand room, but there were no toys or dolls about, and when the fairy saw this, she frowned and shook her head. The head nurse said to the princess, "Your Royal Highness's dinner is now ready." "I don't want any dinner," said Ursula, without turning her head. "I think I have told your Royal Highness before that it is not polite to say you do not want anything, or that you don't like it," said the nurse. "We are waiting for you, your Royal Highness." The princess got up and did as she was told. She saw and the fairy godmother watched all this. She saw how the little girl was spoken to. She saw how pale little Ursula was, and how little she ate, and that there was no talking or laughing aloud. The fairy godmother sighed and frowned even more than before, and she flew back to her fairy home and thought for many hours about what to do. At last she got up and went to pay a visit to a shop, the largest shop in fairyland. It was a queer sort of place. It was neither a grocer's, nor a draper's, nor a hatter's. Yet it contained sugar and dresses and hats, but the sugar was magic sugar, which transformed any liquid into what it was put inside. The dresses each had some special charm, and the hats a wishing cap. It was in fact a shop where every sort of spell or charm was sold, a magic shop. The fairy godmother talked to the owner of the shop. "I want," she said, "a princess." "A princess," said the shopman, who was in reality an old wizard. "What size do you want? I have one or two in stock." "It's very precise," the fairy godmother said. "It must look now about 6 years old, but it must also grow to full adult size." I can make you one of those," said the wizard, "but it'll be rather expensive." "I don't mind that," said the fairy godmother. "See, I want it to look exactly like this." So saying, she took a portrait of Ursula out of her bosom, out of her pocket, and gave it to the old man, who examined it carefully. "I'll get it for you," he said. When would you want it?" "As soon as possible," said Tabouret, the fairy godmother. Let's see, it's gonna be expensive. And what sort of voice is it to have?" It didn't need talk. It should just say, "If you please, no thank you, certainly and just so." "Well, in that case," said the wizard, "I would do it for 4 cats' footfalls, 2 fishes' screams, and 2 swan songs." "Oh, that's too much. I'll give you the footfalls and the screams, but to ask for swan songs." Well, they bargained for a bit, and then the fairy godmother got her own way. She flew off, and the next day she came and she fetched the princess, and it was amazingly work. It just looked exactly like the little princess, and it said exactly the 4 things that she'd asked it to say. If you like, it was basically a little princess robot. So the fairy godmother took it to the castle, and she replaced this toy princess with she took the real princess away. She replaced it with the toy princess, and she took the real princess back to her mother's kingdom, where this family of fishermen took her in to live with them. And there she was very happy. She was able to laugh and cry and express her emotions, and everything felt right. While back in the kingdom, well, they didn't even notice that there'd been a big change really in the princess. Other than that, they thought, oh, she was learning very well now. She was acting appropriately according to her manners. After some time, the fairy godmother realised that the king had become old. Ursula had grown up into a nice young woman, and but in the kingdom where she'd come from, where she was born and her mother had died, the king was aging, and they were talking about handing over the reins to the princess, the toy princess. Well, the fairy godmother went and she asked to talk to the king. She said, "There's something I need to explain to you. Going way back, I replaced your daughter with a toy princess. This one is the fake one. The real one is safe and sound in the land where her mother came from." Well, the king didn't really believe anything she said. I mean, that this is his daughter, and she's going to take over the kingdom, and everything as it should be. Oh, the fairy godmother got mad, so mad that she struck at the head of the toy princess, and the head came off and rolled along the floor. and it said, "Just so," very politely. The king sat back into his chair. Oh dear, this is all true. "Let me fetch the real princess," said the fairy godmother. She brought back the girl to her father. And now the king thought it would be best interest of the kingdom to vote about whether they should keep the toy princess, whose head could be fixed back on, of course, or the real princess, who wasn't all that keen to return home because she didn't like it there. "Oh, there should be no doubt which one everyone would prefer," said the Prime Minister to the Chancellor. "I should think not either," answered the Chancellor. "Then vote," said the fairy godmother. And they all voted, and every vote was for the toy princess. The fairy godmother laughed. "You are a pack of idiots," she said, "but you shall have what you want." She picked up the head, and with a wave of her wand stuck it onto the toy princess's body, and it moved around slowly and said, "Certainly," just in its old voice. And on hearing all this, all the courtiers gave something like a cheer, something it was a bit more polite, while the old king could not speak for joy. "We will," the king said, "at once make arrangements for abdicating, and leave the government in the hands of our dear daughter." And on hearing this, the courtiers applauded again. The fairy godmother laughed scornfully, taking up the real princess in her arms, flew back with her to Mark's cottage. The Mark was a fisherman. In the evening, the city was illuminated, and there were great rejoicings at the recovery of the princess. But the princess, the true princess, remained in the cottage, and over time she fell in love with the fisherman's son and lived happily with them, the family that had taken her in for the rest of her life.